Madam Deputy Speaker, the Armed Forces Bill fulfils the legal responsibility upon the MOD to update the Armed Forces Act every 5 years, but it does, of course, do much more. Firstly, it honours the recommendations of the Lyons Review, several of which I argued for as a serving officer. So it delivers what the Armed Forces want, and it shows that the MOD is supportive of them. It delivers, too, on a commitment made in the 2019 manifesto to bring the Armed Forces Covenant into statute and fulfil a long-standing promise to our service community. But it also shows that in this post-Brexit era, the British government is able to pass laws that may have been more difficult under the EU. Our service justice system has long been in the sights of the EU courts, and the MOD has done well to preserve it for the good and benefit of our armed forces. No doubt the legislation will get attacked for what it's not, but from experience, the bill is a good one. The technical term for it is no-brainer, and I'll be supporting the government today. At its simplest level, the legislation provides the framework for the excellent work conducted for many years by councils, health and education providers right across the UK. And I want to pay my own tribute to the many councils and armed forces champions who have done so much. Why not legislate, too, to establish armed forces champions in law? For having reinforced the government myself for so many years, not least amongst our brilliant champions in Surrey and Berkshire, I can say this with complete confidence. So on to the clauses, if I may. For clauses 4 to 7, the Armed Forces Act operates on the basis of beyond reasonable doubt. So it's entirely correct that commanding officers and courts-martial are provided with a means of rectifying errors of judgment. To be worthy of their preeminence, notably when new evidence comes to light, the ability to admonish or even overturn outcomes is welcome.
Would the Honourable Gentleman give way?
Please.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I thank my very good friend for giving way. He was a commanding officer, as I was. He will have sent people to court-martials when he didn't really want to. And one of the things this bill brings in is the ability for commanding officers to, in support of their men and women, to give them additional support when they've had to send them to court-martial, and they can actually then involve themselves more in the court-martial to try and say, please, for example, can this man or this woman come back to my unit rather than be discharged from the service because they're good people.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I thank my good friend for his intervention, and I agree completely. I think it's really important that commanding officers do have some input into the service law process, not just to sort of provide mitigation and character references, but also to influence perhaps the outcomes of that court. And certainly the ability for soldiers to serve on the recommendation of the commanding officer is really important. At Clause 8, bringing the Armed Forces Covenant into statute is long overdue, and I welcome the clarification that provisions will be mandated in law for housing, health and education. Yes, further guidance on exactly what councils will be asked to do will be welcome. I would also welcome confirmation, if I may, of when the Secretary of State might present his annual report on the Covenant at the dispatch box. At Clause 9, I welcome the increased flexibility available to our reserve forces through the new continuous service engagement. Part-time work rightly augments full-time work. At Clauses 10 and 11, I agree that the MOD wishes to speed up the complaints process, but I would urge the Minister and the Secretary of State to remain cognizant of just how busy most senior officers are. I also welcome the creation of the new Service Police Complaints Commissioner for all the reasons we've heard earlier from my good friend, but as long as the mechanism is built in to ensure that clearly vexatious complaints are filtered out early. And that's something which needs to happen for all service complaints, the ability of the chain of command to filter them out where they are clearly vexatious. And lastly, I really welcome the enhanced powers given to commanding officers and courts-martial at clauses 13 to 17. Not only is it right that the service justice system can now preside over offences that previously could only be heard in a civil court, but as a former commanding officer, I am positively salivating at the prospect of deprivation orders. Given that the proceeds or means of executing crime can now be confiscated from errant soldiers, what a brilliant way perhaps of offsetting the costs of the regimental Christmas party.
I'm not sure.
Madam Deputy Speaker, this bill reflects what our armed forces have asked for. It brings them up to date with what they need, and I'll be voting it through. Thank you.
Kevin Jones.
Can I begin by thanking our members of our armed forces for work they do? The Minister, the member for Plymouth Moor View, said in the Bill Committee on the Overseas Bill that the government would bring forward legislation in this bill today that would make it illegal to discriminate servicemen and women and veterans. Madam Speaker, it does nothing of the sort. It gives due regard for a limited number of public bodies outlined by my honourable friend for Wentworth. And if you add then section B, which says by stating that public bodies must play due regard for it to be desirable to remove disadvantage. Now, to hear some people talk, you'd think the covenant was something invented 10 years ago. It didn't. It's originated in the 2008 command paper published by Bob Ainsworth when he was